Yes.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Nick.
I'm a bit nervous because I'm testing for the first time. Well, not testing. I'm applying it for the first time in a live recording. The new functionality of iPhone and Mac. You can now use your iPhone as a webcam for in Zoom calls. So actually, the video that you see is from my iPhone. Is the camera that I'm using, not the camera from the laptop. So I like technology, but I won't say I'm a technology expert. So I hope I've set up everything correctly. It was
I
quite
don't
easy
see any
actually.
difference.
No.
No.
Okay. I suggest we dive right into the
Yeah.
conversation, Tom. Okay.
Yeah.
Typically we start with some first opening questions so that our listeners can build up some personal connection with you. And I was wondering, if you look at 2022, who in your family surprised you the most this year and why?
Yeah, I had to think about this question, and I think I'm ending with my, or coming up with my kids, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm. What I like about having kids, and they're 6 and 7 years old, two boys, is that is a kind of reflection of a life which starts again, so to say. And what I just find very funny is, let's say, the way they behave, just in general. So I don't have a very specific
Mm.
uh, example, but what I just see all the time is that kids ask those questions you don't realize you would ask them yourselves. So for
Mm-hmm.
instance, what do you do in the office? One of my boys asked,
Well,
what do you do there?
let's answer the question. What do you do in the office, Tom?
So and then I just answered and said, that's a very good question. I also sometimes I really don't know what I'm doing there, but it was just a joke for myself. But it's I like the reflection of having kids, because they get you sometimes out of your totally rational environment you're in, and then they ask you questions. This
Mm-hmm.
office question was just one example.
Well, yeah. I remember the podcast I did with NK Shot Harry from Jaipur Rugs. I think the first question I asked him was like, if I would ask your mother to describe you, how would she describe you? And you have to know the man is 70 years old, and he said, well, I think she would say I'm still a child, and I'm proud of it, and I'm proud of it.
I know him
Uh,
very well.
yeah. You know him very well.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm
yeah,
visiting him in January.
yeah.
There.
Okay, you have to
Yeah.
say greetings to him.
Okay, I will. But let me steal the question of your son. I think it's a good way to introduce also you as a professional and your company to our listeners. So, what do you do at work?
I could repeat the answer that I also sometimes don't know now, but that's what do I do in the office? We do mortgage advice, so just very normal if people want to buy an apartment or a house, and we work with a self-organizational structure. Yeah, so it's called holacracy. And you have different roles. And currently, I am the lead link, so the kind of CEO of the company, but that sometimes also rotates and depends a little bit on the situation. But I also did different uh, stuff in the past, or sometimes I do different stuff. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
things is also to do a lot of media, and that's the role I am in now. I take care of these media roles, or doing presentations about Viisi,
Mm-hmm.
etc. That's also part of my role, because that's not, in our case, not doesn't have to be the CEO role.
Okay,
Um,
and well, now you already triggered my curiosity because you say I'm the lead, kind of the CEO, but also this sometimes rotates.
yeah,
Um, could you give an example? I mean, I think a lot of people in traditional companies are now really thinking, huh? You're the CEO, but it's sometimes you're not. Maybe, if possible, explain it a little bit.
Yeah, we are a self-organization, our structure is about self-organization, and we have certain principles, but we have built our own model. So what we do is that, let's say, in teams we rotate different roles.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be, for instance, the coordinational role, which they you call it takes care of the resources. So how the work is done in a team, and this whole idea of rotation is, let's say, the idea behind it is that you build up as many leadership skills as possible in the whole organization, and it balances your way of power, because everybody is just at a certain point somebody has to take over this responsibility. So I always compare it a little bit with a club of friends who, let's say, do a trip every year, and then you are four friends or six or eight, and then every year somebody else has to organize the retreat or the or
Hmm.
the
That's
the
a good
weekend.
metaphor. That's
and
a good
and and
metaphor.
so, because sometimes we make things very complicated and it's not so difficult, but um, uh, try to keep it simple. And if you have a kind of rotation principle, it balances your team, because you just know you can. It's always very easy to criticize somebody else, but if you know that next year you have to organize the weekend, you better be pretty careful to criticize the, let's say, the hotel or the destination or whatsoever, because
Mm-hmm.
you will be next
Mm-hmm.
year you will be the one who has to organize it. And this kind of principle is very old. It also still exists, but it comes from Polish Athens 2,500 years ago. So it's a mechanism which balances. In that time, it was political power, but you still see it also in structures, in law firms or consultancies or investment banks, where you have a partner structure, and where, for instance, people vote or choose somebody from the partners to be the leading partner for a certain period of time. Or
Mm.
if you have merchant cities, I don't know if in Antwerp it was the case, but if you have, for instance, the
It was.
Dutch Republic, in the whole Republic structure, but you also have Venice or the Hanse cities.
Mm-hmm.
You have the families who rule the city, but they all do they also did it with a rotational principle.
Hmm.
So
So
the
before
people,
before people say, our listeners start saying like, what kind of new age 21st 22nd century even bullshit is this guy sharing with us? No, actually the rotation principle of a leading role in an organization is as old as Athens and democracy itself,
yeah, and
basically.
also our current political system is also a kind of rotation principle, because
Yeah,
we vote
indeed.
all
I was.
every 4 years. So let's say the old model is the monarchy, where people stay in power as long as possible, and then the next generation is able to take over, and they inherit the crown, so to say. And the republican principle, which comes after, is a kind of voting for somebody, but also a kind of rotation
Mm-hmm.
principle. For instance, in the American Constitution or the American system, you can only be chosen for 2 times. So
Mm-hmm.
you can't stay longer as a president. Or an even much better example is Switzerland, where the government rotates every year. So the chancellor or the president of the Swiss Republic, every year somebody else from the government takes over.
Okay, I
Uh,
didn't know that.
Now,
Okay.
I also didn't know until I moved to Switzerland, but that's a very very old system, so to say.
Okay. I can imagine that such a context in which you rotate and take up different roles, it helps build your personal development. So, what would you say is life and your work teaching you at this very moment? What are you really learning from the challenges that are being presented at work at this very moment?
Yeah, what I mean, we are doing this podcast now in beginning of December, 22, and let's say it's a tough time. Economy goes into recession, high inflation, especially for instance in our market, the mortgage market. It's
Mm.
I wouldn't say it collapsed, but it really is a totally different situation than a year ago. And what you see in our structure, and it's also a question again and again: does a self-organizational structure works in times of crisis? And it's really interesting to see that, let's say, in times of crisis, you have a kind of different principle. Normally, if everything goes very smoothly and you don't have any problems, then you focus much more on rotation and giving everybody without any experience a chance to develop their skills, because at that time it's not very critical. And then we always had the principle of rotation over experience, and we were
Mm-hmm.
always focusing on that because the normal reaction is somebody has done the job, let's say for half a year in a very good way, and then everybody says, Nick, you're doing so great as a facilitator or a moderator or a secretary or a lead link. Just continue because you did a great job. And then we always had to say, yes, that could be a very easy reaction and also a very easy decision, but that's not the goal. The goal is to give other colleagues also a possibility to learn, and then often you just experience in a team that there are a lot of people are capable of a lot of stuff. They perhaps even themselves didn't know they were able to do so. So it creates an enormous development in your whole organization. And now I come to the point of a crisis. In times of crisis, it's the other way around. Then you have to focus in a totally different way. You have some difficult decisions to take in a lot of let's say businesses, and then suddenly experience and responsibility, and which goes together, plays a much more important role than at that moment the rotation principle of giving an opportunity to somebody who is not experienced. Because if times get tough, then it's not the wisest situation or decision then to experiment
Mm-hmm.
if you're not experienced. So let's say if you would, I always like to take simple examples. So if the weather is very nice and you're sailing, then you can just say to somebody who is not a sailor, and I'm not a sailor, by the way, will you
Neither.
just take over? Do you want to sail a little bit? And then you can just learn and say, oh, I like to sail. But if you go into a thunderstorm, then it would make sense that the person takes over who is an experienced sailor. So, and
Okay.
that's something which at the moment we just see, and it's just nice to see that you are able to adapt in such a situation in a very fast way, and everybody also understands
Mm.
that it makes sense then to to hand over, for instance, responsibility
Mm-hmm.
to people who have done, let's say,
Mm.
the job 25 years and not
Yeah.
just arrived, let's say, a year ago.
Tom, to be absolutely 100% clear and not create any misconceptions with our listeners, when you say in times of crisis it's experience over rotation, it still means it's experience within the self-organizing structure. It's not like, oh, it's crisis, we centralize the power back to one
No, no,
person with the most experience. You still remain within the same
yeah, yeah,
self-organizing structure. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But let's say, just take an example. You have, for instance, a secretary role is a role where you have to be um, just, let's say, from functional skills, be able to have a lot of tabs open and a lot of metrics, etc., etc. And if you're not used to that, then it can be very stressful. And if you
Mm-hmm.
are experienced, then it is not stressful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Viisi, was awarded Great Place to Work both in the Netherlands and in Europe, right?
Yeah, 4
Yeah.
times we were #1 in Netherlands.
How
And
does that feel to be recognized? What does that do to you and your colleagues?
yeah, that's a question we often get. And the funny thing is, it's even a kind of ambivalent. So, and
Mm-hmm.
and I have to explain why. On the one hand, it's great because an external reward also says something about, let's say, the status of the company. But the interesting thing is that the first time we got these awards, or I think the second one time, we had much higher fluctuation than before, and then it also felt a little bit awkward.
Mm-hmm.
And then we find out that people were mainly applying on the self-organizational structure and a lot of other stuff we do, and
Mm.
less about, let's say, being a
You're,
mortgage advisor.
yeah.
So I mean, it could be very easy just to answer, oh, we were so happy, we were the greatest company, etc., etc. Now, it's a little bit more complicated. And the other aspect I would like to say is, in the end, we don't we're not interested that much in those awards per se. It's more about, it gives you a kind of structure, because you have to to reflect on certain topics once in a while,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to fill out, let's say, a questionnaire, etc. So it gives you a kind of rhythm,
Mm.
which helps. But in the end, the only thing which is decisive is what kind of, let's say, note, or what kind of feedback do you get from your own people.
Mm-hmm.
That's much more important than if you are done, let's say, #1 or #15. In the end, I mean, yeah, it's nice because everybody says, "Oh, you're a winner," and then we were 3 times in a row, or 4 times in a row, even #1 in the Netherlands. But um, probably in the long run, I would say, if you're always, let's say, in this list, in this category of the first 10, and then everything is also fine. So I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't make it
Mm-hmm.
more important than it is.
Um, yeah, and I resonate with the experience that this type of publicity also has a downside, in the sense that it might attract a certain type of people that actually don't really fit with the actual core value that you're trying to create, but that are attracted because of the award that you receive. So
Yeah, and
I've
there's also another aspect on, about this. So it also can create the kind of bias of overconfidence.
Mm-hmm.
So you think at a certain moment, and that's also the reason, for instance, why we implemented the rotation principle. Because, let's say, after a certain time, you think that the success of a company, or the you think you have taken the right decisions, but that's not the case. So there's an enormous amount of luck. It depends on the
Mm-hmm.
economic circumstances, etc., etc. And then at a certain time, let's say, if you would be, let's say, #1 as an employer all the time, you say, okay, we're doing so brilliantly, we don't have to, we don't, we can't become better. We are
Yeah,
already the best, so to say. So
yeah.
it's this kind of
And
idea of,
maybe also, Tom, that I'm not saying it's the case, but it's what I experienced, that it can impact the psychological safety in the organization with people that do have tensions with the way things are going, but there's an immediate reaction like, hey, I mean, they bagatelize, I don't know if that's an English word, but they
downplay.
they downplay the tension someone expresses,
Yeah,
like, hey, come on, we're the #1 greatest place, what are you complaining about? Okay, maybe can you so I will share with the release of the podcast the document that your colleague Mark Peter, the link to the cultural audit, where Well, it's a fantastic document, by the way. My compliments, and every single detail of how you guys work is beautifully described there. But we can summarize it into 10 rules, I might say. Could you maybe just present those 10 rules briefly? And then I want to ask you a little bit about how these rules came about. And then we'll zoom into 2-3 of those rules in detail. Okay?
Yeah. I will start by saying how we came to those 10 rules. I wrote an article on the platform Corporate Rebels, which, by the way, I mean, you know the platform. I think people who listen to your podcast are probably also familiar with the Corporate Rebels, and if they are not, it makes sense to have a look at the website. And then one of the founders of the Corporate Rebels said, "Could you please summarize it or just put it in a more practical way?" And then I just started to write them down, and then finally there were 10. And the 10, I let's say the topic is, we call it less is more, and that was the article I wrote about less is more. And then the question was, okay, what are the practical examples of that? And the practical examples of less is more is the one we already a little bit discussed, now bosses, but primus inter pares, that is rotation principle. Then the second one is no functions role. We have those roles and we don't have any business cards. So it's very simple. We only have one title, it's called visionaire, so somebody who works for Viisi. We work with autonomy, and we also touch a little bit upon that topic with holacracy, so not the permission culture. We work in a horizontal way, so very team focused. That doesn't mean that there aren't layers, but the main decision making structure is a horizontal one. We don't have bonuses, but fixed salaries. We don't have performance reviews, only peer-to-peer feedback in the teams on a daily basis. We don't have classical HR hiring, but the teams hire themselves. We don't have handbooks. We only have the so-called golden rule. And that means that you treat other people like you want to be treated yourself. We don't have budgets. Or let's say we have budgets, but we try to avoid budgets as much as possible, which is called beyond budgeting, also not invented by us. And we have a culture of radical transparency, and that means that we share everything which is possible. So the principle is exactly the opposite. We share everything, or there must be a good reason not to share it. And that means, for instance, client data is not shared. But for instance, the culture audit, as you just mentioned, is normally a document which is not shared. And then we asked Great Place to Work and said, okay, shall we just share our culture audit? Because we want to inspire as many people as possible, and people can just inspire themselves. I mean, they don't have to copy our model, but perhaps it's a good inspiration for a lot of people. And I said, yeah, you can share, but it's not normal to share your cultural audit, because the cultural audit is, as an audit often is, something which is a kind of secret document for internal purposes. So we changed it.
How there's a misconception that often comes back when people talk about self-organization, and it's like it's the perception that there are no rules, everybody can just do what they want, which is obviously the recipe for chaos. And as your 10 rules are a great example, you guys have crystal clear rules, very simple, less rules than in a typical organization, but the rules that are there are very clear and understandable by everybody. Could you share your view on why it is important to have these rules, what these 10 rules, what's the role that they play in the organization?
I don't know how important they are. So I even would think that most of our colleagues were not able to mention the 10 rules. And I also have to read them from a piece of paper. So that's what I also said. I wrote them down, and then it also, let's say, is a very practical way of telling something about your model. But I would just say culture is something which lives in a company, and then at a certain point you start to write stuff down, and sometimes other experiences are added to the whole system. Perhaps then we should update it after a certain period of time, and then change one and say, okay, no, another rule which we all also have, but we didn't think about it, should be added, etc. So I just think it's a kind of living organism which is just built by the people, and our whole organizational structure has some very basic rules of behaving towards each other. So the golden rule, I would say, is in the center of the whole model, because the starting point is you would treat other people like you want to be treated yourself, and it can be towards customers or partners or the environment or the state or whatsoever, and that keeps it very, yeah, I don't know if the word fresh or actual is the good word, but it sharpens the mind all the time, because you ask all the time, if something happens, you don't ask, where do I find this in a kind of rule book? No, you just say, okay, if I would be the client at this moment, how would I think or like to be treated by, let's say, a Viisi advisor? Or if I would talk about a partnership, if I would sit on the other side of the table, what would I expect from Viisi? And because this golden rule is so compact, or so reduced to the max, I think the model stays fresh, but in a way, our societies with our basic rules in the constitution, it's about the basic rules in the constitution and not about, let's say, details. I mean, you can have details in certain fields, but it's about the main topics and to stay focused on the main principles of your organization. I think that's the core.
So the role that you want these principles to play is that people in their daily rituals and practices, they're doing stuff and then reflect on, okay, is this my interpretation of, for example, the golden rule? Is this how I would like to be treated by a Viisi advisor? So that's the rule. It's kind of a moral compass for people to benchmark their decisions and their activities.
Yeah, it's, you could even say it's more kind of principles for working together, then, because rules always have something, a kind of bureaucratic connotation, like if you talk about tax rules, etc. Doesn't have to be, but if you take, for instance, this book of the Netflix founder, No Rules, it always a question of a kind of definition. So I would call them principles, which is much nearer to how do we behave to each other than this idea of a rule which has a kind of bureaucratic connotation.
And if imagine that I would start working for Viisi, how do I learn about these principles? Is this something that's integrated in the recruitment process? Is this something that you learn just by working there with ups and downs, or how does that work?
It's a combination. So let's say the people who start at Viisi, 50% of the time they know already somebody who works at our company, and then or people were clients. Mark Peter, you just mentioned, was a client, and then he said, okay, that's interesting, interesting company. Never would have thought he would work for a mortgage advisor. And then we have 25% of people who read about the company. So I would say we are in an exceptional situation that people who apply for, let's say, apply at our company already are a little bit familiar with the way we work. Then you have the onboarding, and then you go into detail. That's also a topic, for instance, where Mark Peter plays a very important role. And then we share, let's say, that's the way we work at Viisi, and then we explain what self-organization is, etc., etc. But the last part you mentioned, just let's say learning or working on the job, is, I think, in most companies the most decisive part, because let's say if you just join, for instance, a session, if you join a meeting, which by the way everybody can do, there is a holacracy safari, it's called, every Monday morning, and people are just able to join, and then they see how do we work together in this meeting structure. So I think in the end you can tell people from a theoretical aspect how things work, but in the end you just have to do it. It's a little bit telling about how a hamburger tastes, but in the end you have to take a bite and then say, okay, do you like a hamburger or not? So I think this practical way of just working together, and then it evolves. And what's very interesting is that if you have a kind of structure, people adapt automatically to the structure. So for people who join and who don't have an enormous amount of working experience, it's their reality. And also people who used to work for a long time at other companies, they're also totally familiar with this way of working after, let's say, a couple of weeks.
Yeah, the impact of set and setting in which you setting in which you work, heavily impacts your mindset and your behavior indeed. Have you ever had someone that structurally has a totally different interpretation of the principles than what, let's say, the majority of the company has? So someone who says yes to all the principles, but then in acting out the principles, you just notice that they don't really fit. Have you ever had that?
Good question. A very, let's say, strong examples we don't have, but it has to do also with the fact that, let's say, most people are pretty young. So let's say what I can say is it's easier. I mean, if you don't have 20 years of working experience and you just finish your university degree, or if you've worked for 1 or 2 years in a corporate environment, it's much easier to adapt to the model than if you have 25 years of experience working in a let's say rather corporate bureaucratic environment, because the difference is just much bigger. But having said that, we didn't have that big problems. But it's a little bit like if you have to work in a digital environment and somebody is much older, it doesn't mean that people who are much older are not familiar with, let's say, using FaceTime or using an iPhone, etc. So
it's not age related.
no, but there still is a kind of
there's a correlation, but
there's a correlation. So if I see, let's say, the younger generation, I'm 54, and if I just see the speed where people on their iPhone send WhatsApp text messages, they're much faster than I am, as an example. So there is a kind of correlation, but in the end, depends very much on the attitude of the person themselves. What you always see is, but that's in every organization, that you have now and then discussions about a certain interpretation. Or just take an example of this rotation principle, that for instance in times of crisis where things have to go much faster, and sometimes are, let's say, more difficult, then it's important to explain that the structure doesn't change, or the model of self-organization doesn't change, but the principle of experience is more important in times of crisis than normally, and that should, let's say, play a more decisive role than the rotation. That's very normal. But if you, let's say, if you have to just take the soccer tournament at the moment, the World Championships, if you have to take a penalty and somebody's very experienced, and you are Ronaldo, then it would be strange to give somebody opportunity who has never done those penalties at a World Soccer Championship, to say to this person who plays his second match do you want to take the first penalty? No,
Mm-hmm.
then probably Ronaldo should take the first penalty.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
so
Again,
it's,
a
I
good
think,
metaphor.
yeah, I think these practical examples show that, let's say, with common sense, you can solve most problems in a company, as you also solve problems in daily life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's zoom into a couple of these principles. I'd like to start with no bosses, but primus inter pares. We already talked about a little bit about the rotation principle. So it's not all in the. I would say the leader or the lead link depends on the context and the situation, and it's not always the same person. I guess a lot of companies ask themselves, yeah, but how does that then work in really in practice? You know, is it crystal clear for everyone who will take the final decision depending on which topic is being decided? Or so maybe touch a little bit on that.
Yeah, I'll just take another example. I take our credit department, and let's say if 6 colleagues work together in the credit department, and then every half year somebody else takes over this coordination role. And it's a little bit comparable, let's say, with all those agile developments or projects. It's more a kind of project role.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a huge role. So it's not because everybody has responsibility for its own role. It's more about kind of coordinational responsibility. It's not about telling other people how to do their work,
Yeah.
because everybody is owning the responsibility of their own role. And you can
Mm-hmm.
just also, in our structure, you can just look that up and then see what accountabilities every role has. So a lead link has nothing to do with the accountabilities of those roles. It's more about let's say, if you have a certain amount of work that somebody has to check. Okay, in the past it was very simple. Once a day you got a lot of letters, and then you had to decide, okay, if you have a team of so many people, who is going to answer which letter. And has somebody much more work to do than the other one, and then somebody has said, okay, so we just discuss this, and then also try to level the workload in the team. So leveling the workload in the team, which is then called the resources. uh, so what kind of capabilities do you have in your team to get the work done? That's more leveling about the resources. But it also can be that, let's say, somebody has a private situation where somebody has less possibilities of taking care of a lot of stuff, and then you also have to balance this.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
more or less the
So
role.
I think it's fair to say, compared to the way a classic team works, in your teams, every individual takes on all the responsibility that is linked to their role, and therefore the manager role is downsides to coordination work, as you explained, and in exceptions when someone has a personal problem, how are we to coordinate how we're going to deal with that, rather than in a classic team where you have a manager with tons of responsibility. So the workload
Yep.
of a lead link is maybe 10-20% of his or her time, and that's the role that okay.
Yeah, and what is perhaps also interesting to explain is that in Dutch you call it werkende voorman. So it's somebody, it's just one of the colleagues who does the same work but has some extra responsibilities of coordinating the work of the whole team. That's what actually happens. And that if you let's say take the continental European Rhineland capitalism, how they call this, the small medium-sized enterprises, then you just have, and you have this still everywhere. Let's say if you have a painting company, or you do something together, then you just have a guy who also works on the construction site, but who is still taking care of the team. but he's not standing just by his side and telling the other ones how to paint the new windows. No, he also paints a window, but he's just the guy who is in charge of 4 people painting the windows of this new construction site.
Yeah, indeed. I'm going to touch on the principle on feedback. So you said no, not yearly evaluation, but feedback, day-to-day, peer-to-peer feedback. The reason why I bring this up is because in the model that you work with, that's kind of super important, right? Because it might be that some people enjoy more the freedom than the responsibility that comes with your model, and other people, they might take up much more responsibility than and so there might be a disbalance between how much responsibility people in the same role take on, which might create tensions. Doesn't have to be, it might create tensions, and the way to tackle those tensions is when people openly give feedback to each other. So could you touch on the principle of feedback and how it works?
Yeah, first perhaps to zoom out, we have those fixed salaries to create psychological safety. Yeah, so I think people who listen to your workshop may be familiar with this principle, psychological safety. Amy Edmondson became very famous by her book, and psychological safety means that you are able to share on the one hand your vulnerabilities and say, I'm not sure, shall I go do this or that? And on the other hand, also being able to give colleagues feedback and say, I would better, or my experience is this or that. And if you have fixed salaries, you know that in both directions, it doesn't harm the salary of yourself or the colleague. And that's something very, very important, which is the opposite in the bonus culture. Because then if you give negative feedback, you just know you're just skip the bonus of your colleague, so to say. So that's the starting point. So there is the security and the psychological safety of sharing feedback. Then how does it work? If people work together in a team and everybody does more or less the same job, it's peer-to-peer. It's just horizontal feedback. So it's not vertical feedback of somebody who is not doing the job that him or herself comes by and then criticizes and gives feedback to people. No, it's just one of those people in the team. They just give each other feedback all day. And I think the starting point is that you are able to share your doubts. So doubts or not being sure is something positive. Because if you're not sure, and then you also have this idea of the biases again, then you ask, okay, I'm thinking I have this topic, shall I do it in this way or in that way? And then somebody says, yeah, no, I would do it in that way. And if let's say 1 or 2 people and you're not sure, they will say, no, I will do it in that way. Then your quality of decision making is much higher than if you say, I'm not going to ask anybody, although I'm not sure. I better go for the wrong decision, but I don't want to show any weaknesses. And that's the normal situation. So your quality of decision making or the quality of work done in the team just gets higher. Is it seen as something negative feedback? No, it's not, because the decision making capabilities or skills of everybody in the team, they grow. And the more information is shared, the faster also the development of all those people is, because information flows all the time. So it's seen as something which is positive.
Fully agree. And so my follow-up question is really on the nitty-gritty. So I fully agree that quality of dialogue, quality of information flow is much higher than in the classic team setup. However, even in that situation, and even with fixed salaries, which I agree, it helps psychological safety. There's also the fact that you also have the fact of emotions. That's some people are just better in giving feedback than others, and some people are better in receiving feedback than others. And if, imagine I give feedback, I try to give feedback to my colleague, and every time the colleague reacts very defensively, right? Almost toxically. And you notice that he doesn't listen to me, but when the lead link, you, for example, one of the founders of the company, says exactly the same thing. He listens well, right? It's really, so this is nitty gritty. You're already,
No,
information flow is high, quality is high, it's much better, but still there you have that personal, the emotional part of giving feedback. Is there anything you guys do to support your people in that, to create a context where people are supported in that?
I don't agree with you. So
I lost your sound.
Okay.
Now it's back. Yeah, now it's back.
I wouldn't actually agree. So research shows that, let's say, peer-to-peer feedback on
just a second, Tom. Just a second. The music starts playing. I don't know what's happening.
I don't hear anything.
Okay. Yeah, I'm back in action. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So I would say that research shows that peer-to-peer feedback of direct colleagues is more productive than vertical feedback also of the lead link.
Fully agree.
Although let's say the lead link in normal teams is still on a horizontal basis, but this feedback is given, let's say, if you have tactical or a daily check-in or a daily stand-up, etc. You have this kind of collective intelligence. So if it would be that, let's say, somebody doesn't accept any feedback at all, then in this whole onboarding, and that's why also the hiring aspect of the team itself is so important. The team hires an extra colleague, and everybody has a veto in this process of in this hiring process. So somebody then joins the team. So Nick joins our team, and then let's say Nick doesn't behave. Just take it as an example. Doesn't behave or doesn't receive feedback or like his team colleagues would have expected Nick would do. And they say, Nick, we had such a great impression. Why don't you just accept blah, blah, blah? So and that this goes automatically. So if you would have a very strong example of somebody who did excellent application talks and was able to convince the colleagues and then behaves in a totally different way, perhaps doesn't accept feedback at all, or says, for instance, I don't understand why you do it in this way or in that way, or I think I'm much better than the other ones, I should receive a bonus, etc. Then people would just say, okay, then we would recommend you just to go somewhere else. So in the end, we don't have that many problems because it's not one against one, so to say. No, it's a kind of collective process where a team works together. And if it would be, let's say, in a one-to-one situation, then people would address this and say, okay, let's just discuss this with, let's say, in the broader team meeting, because let's say we have a different opinion about, let's say, the way we work together, etc. So
okay,
it's
clear.
It's what I always find interesting is, and that you see this over and over again, that if you work with structures like we do, we have to explain all the time why it works. Although if you just do it the other way around and you take a, let's say, normal structure or a normal corporation or a normal company where everybody knows it doesn't work, just for instance, take bonuses. Bonuses are counterproductive. A lot of work done, a lot of research done on that. Who has to explain all the time that, let's say, fixed salaries work? We have to explain this. And this peer-to-peer feedback, research says peer-to-peer feedback of your direct colleagues on a daily basis works much better than let's say at the end of the year one time and somebody sits there, it's kind of inquisition, and tells you in March you did this. And I always say, if you have kids, do you give them feedback at the moment something happens? But that would be still vertical as a parent. But if you have something with your partner, let's say if I have a discussion with my wife do I just keep this and write it down in the book, and then at the end of the year I do a kind of year-end conversation with my wife and say, in March you said this to me. Everybody starts laughing.
Of
But in
course.
a company, it's exactly the way we do it.
Yeah, but I wasn't, this was not an invitation to prove why it works. My question was an invitation to how, as you mentioned in the beginning, how can you make it even better? And I've experienced myself in those structures, all the benefits that you've explained. And at the same time that I sometimes find it easier to give feedback to person A than it is to person B. It's just a human thing. And that was just that was what my question was referring to. So you don't have
But
to convince me.
no, but what you always have, and that we also have to accept, is that if you, let's say, at a certain amount of people, you have just different constellations which work much better than other ones.
Now we're
and
getting
and
there.
and that's something very natural. So if you, let's say, have a, I don't know because I'm not involved, but if you have, I will just stay to our credit department, and people just find out that, let's say, people would accept feedback from one person, let's say, much better than from another one. What happens in practice? Somebody will just go to this colleague, which somebody likes a lot, and says, Nick, you are one of my favorite colleagues. I'm not quite sure, shall I do this or that? And then Nick answers this or that as an answer. And the person doesn't go to the colleague where, let's say, from an interpersonal aspect, somebody would say, I prefer to get advice from Nick. But
Mhm.
this is solved at a certain amount of people. This is solved in a kind of automatic way. Does it mean that we don't have any discussions? No, you always have on certain topics discussions, and people have different personalities. But what is a good example, what we also do, and that could be, let's say, more technical answer, what we do map is with a kind of strength finder profile, how people interact in those teams. So, and then if people are very familiar with this kind of different personalities, people would say, okay, I think you have a kind of misunderstanding because you have this kind of profile and your colleague has this kind of profile, and you're just communicating on a different level. So somebody can be, for instance, very relational, yellow, and somebody else can be very blue, more rational. And then you have to be aware that the other person has a totally different way of thinking, and that's what you have to match.
Mhm.
But in practice, especially if people stay for a longer time in the company, people are much more familiar with this. So, for instance,
Mhm.
Mark Peter and I, we work together since 6 or 7 years. Mark Peter is much more yellow and I'm much more blue. So if we discuss with each other, then we see that as a kind of different strength, but we still have a different way of approaching problems.
Mm. Okay,
Does this
clear.
answer your question in a better way?
Definitely. I keep mind of the time. I think we have room for one more question, and I wanna combine two things. We already touched upon how Viisi adapts itself in times of crisis, where you say, okay, the structure remains the same, but the principle of experience over rotation or rotation over experience changes. One of the principles is also no budgets beyond budgeting. I'd like you to do two things. First thing, and that was in our preparation talk, you mentioned something like, yeah, the way corporations work today, it's more communism than capitalism. So briefly touch on that. I love that comparison. And then how does your beyond budgeting approach suit or support the adaptation of an organization in times of crisis?
Oh, that's very difficult last questions. Um, okay, let's first start with the second part of your question. In times of crisis, or if you also have a small company and you, let's say, depending on budgets, everybody has to understand that there is a certain amount of, let's say, cost in the company which has to be covered by revenues. And if you have to match this, then it also has to be clear that you can't just say beyond budgeting means that everybody can just spend whatever one would like to spend. It's a little bit, it's the same discussion you have about self-organization. It's not that everybody can just do whatever you would like to do. So just to give a context, but in this context of a kind of certain freedom, and then I build a bridge to communism, is that the more autonomy you have, the wiser or the more intelligent the decisions will be in those teams. So if you have, let's say, a free marketing budget, and you would say, okay, how you would like to spend this, on what topics, is up to the team, makes much more sense than, let's say, far away, somebody else decides how, in what way the marketing budget has to be spent. That doesn't mean that you can't ask critical questions, but the nearer you are, let's say, to the work or to the clients, the better, let's say, the decision should be. And that's the link I always make to communism. If we would ask, or especially people from corporates, if you would discuss with them what's the better system, capitalism or communism, everybody will say capitalism is the much better system. And if you would ask them, why do you think this? Then we all learn that capitalism is the better system because on a decentralized way, people who offer products and people who buy products can decide themselves for what price they're going to sell the products or what price they're going to buy the products. It's a decentralized decision-making principle. If you talk about how companies are organized, then decentralized decision-making is seen as a kind of anarchy. And that's something which I find very funny.
Fascinating observation. Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say, as long as a team stays in the boundaries of the budget, it's wise to give them the autonomy to spend it in the most efficient way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the more you centralize the decision making on targets and budgets, the closer you actually come to a communistic model.
And what you also have is that there is a kind of embedded responsibility, because if you are able to decide for yourself, you want to prove that you're right. So this extra energy, which comes together with self-responsibility, that's also the reason. Let's say if we talk about our system again, we'd say free enterprises, entrepreneurs, they believe in their own idea. I mean, only 1 out of 100 survives, but this energy and this responsibility and this belief in let's say in our own ideas as entrepreneurs creates an enormous amount of power and great ideas. Only a few survive, but it is much more efficient than our communistic system.
Yeah. So a lot of corporates, and that's, I think, a great way to conclude our conversation, are looking for ways to, what they call, empower people, give people more autonomy, pioneering spirit, things like that. Those are the words on the slides. If they're not decentralizing the decision power on the money, it is basically just talk and no action. Would that be a good summary? Do you agree with that? Or is it too provocative?
I don't know. I think it really depends on the different companies. But you see, for instance, that Google in the past also, if they talk about innovation, said, okay, 1 day a week you can decide yourself you want to work on, and now they are skipping this, which in the end will mean that you will have less innovation. Innovation always comes from people who leave companies because they didn't have the freedom to develop the ideas they really would like to work on. And that's why Google invented this 5th day. So there you see exactly the same. So give people autonomy also to test their own ideas, which are in the interest of the company. Because if people leave the company and become, let's say, start their own companies, that's what happens all the time. That's why companies don't survive. At a certain point, companies don't survive because the ideas which were there in the company, those employees had to leave the company because they didn't have the space to to implement this innovation in the company itself.
That's a good one to conclude our conversation, Tom. Thank you so much. I love the passion with which you talk about these topics and about your company. We touched on a lot of topics. Wow. Thank you so much. And yeah, keep you posted.
Yeah, thank you for your time and the interesting conversation.